I do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
I would like to call the first witness, Dr. Brigit Mirfin Veitch.
Thank you. Once you're settled, I would like, under the terms of the Inquiries Act, to ask you to confirm the following, Doctor. Do you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you will give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Ms Thomas.
Thank you. Atamarie, do you have a brief of evidence before you in the folder?
Yes, I do.
And can you confirm that is your brief of evidence that you have signed and dated?
Yes.
And confirm that is correct?
I do.
Thank you. Do you also have on the table before you the document Institutions are Places of Abuse?
Yes, I do.
And that is a report that you have co-authored with Dr. Jenny Conda?
Yes.
And I would ask you now to produce that document as Exhibit 6 in this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just before we begin into your evidence today, I understand that you would like to make an acknowledgement.
Yes, I would. Tēnā koutou katoa. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the disabled children and adults who have informed and shaped my own understandings of abuse. It is their stories that underpin the brief I'm speaking to today. Many of these individuals are no longer with us and were therefore unable to support the call for an inquiry into abuse and care. Sadly, these men and women will also never know that thousands of New Zealanders joined together to demand an inquiry and an apology on their behalf, or that this demand was ultimately successful. It is these people I acknowledge today, along with those who are yet to tell their stories. Thank you.
Just a reminder, we will be speaking slowly, so everything we are saying is being typed up. Thank you. So we will just pause if necessary. Can you please tell us briefly who you are and your area of expertise?
Sure. As you know, my name's Brigit Mirfin Veitch. I'm the Director of the Donald Beasley Institute, which is a position that I've held since 2007, but I've been a member of the DBI staff since 1994. The Donald Beasley Institute is an independent charitable trust that conducts research and education in the area of disability, and we have a specific focus on learning disability. I'm also a Senior Research Fellow with the Centre for Postgraduate Nursing Studies at the University of Otago and an Adjunct Associate Professor with Deakin University, Victoria, Australia. I'm a sociologist. I have a strong interest in understanding the social lives of people with learning disability, and I'm committed to initiating and achieving social change through research. My research has explored deinstitutionalisation from the perspective of family members of people with learning disability who were moving from Templeton Centre.
Dr. Mirfin Veitch,
slow down.
It may be helpful, yes, it may be helpful if you keep in your sight the stenotyper,
sure,
who is functioning at high speed but may not be able to, or will be assisted if you keep an eye on the pace.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
I was just noting that I've done research around deinstitutionalisation that focused on the Templeton Centre, a large institution for children and adults with learning disability located near Christchurch. I was also part of a team of researchers from the Donald Beasley Institute who explored the deinstitutionalisation or the closure of Kimberley Centre, one of New Zealand's last large institution to close. I've also engaged with institutionalisation and deinstitutionalisation more recently as a co-author of Institutions Are Places of Abuse, the Experience of Disabled Children and Adults in State Care, which was published in 2017 and which was an exhibit that I showed earlier. I will note that the title of that piece of work, we acknowledge Robert Martin, who will be speaking next week, as the person that provided the inspiration for that title. In addition, throughout my 25 years as a disability researcher with the DBI, I've conducted research in the area of parenting by people with learning disability, health and wellbeing, the justice system, and more recently around sexuality and relationships. And all of this research has included a significant number of people with learning disabilities who have reported that they experienced abuse and care during research institutes, despite the fact that the research was not specifically about abuse.
Give evidence at this hearing today about the nature and extent of abuse and neglect that has occurred to people with learning disabilities in state care between the 1950s and 1990s. Mm-hmm. And you've drawn on the report, Institutions Are Places of Abuse, as part of your brief.
Yes.
Just before we get into the detail of your evidence, there's various terminology that you've used in your brief. Can you please take us through that, just to explain the terms?
Sure. I've been asked to give evidence about the nature and extent of abuse, and I'm going to talk about the impacts of such abuse on individuals. But one of the things that I did note in my brief, that I'm not a clinician. So as a first parameter around the evidence that I'm giving is that I'm a researcher. I hear a lot about I research people's experiences, and what I'm going to talk about today are those experiences and how people have felt, what they've told me about them, but I do note that I am not a clinician, so I'm not making a clinical judgment about the impacts that people have experienced when they're talking about abuse and care. I think your other part of your question is related to how we did the research.
Yes, but also perhaps in terms of if you turn to paragraph 10 of your
Sure.
brief, and you've referred to the terminology to be used when referring to someone with a learning disability. If you could just take us through that.
Sure. I'll take a step back and just note that the research that we're talking about today was undertaken in 2007 during the campaign for a commission of inquiry into abuse and care. The research was contracted by the Human Rights Commission, and it was details research that so that we could capture the voices and experiences of disabled people as part of this conversation that was going on. I note that I use the term learning disability throughout the brief. People First New Zealand, which is a disabled persons organisation, promote the use of the term learning disability instead of intellectual disability. They feel the term is more respectful, reflective of the difficulties that they experience, and easier to say. So therefore, learning disability is the term that I'm using today. But in doing so, I acknowledge that intellectual disability, mentally retarded or mentally subnormal were commonly used terms during the period 1950 to 1992.
You've said that your research responded to a concern that disabled people, including people with a learning disability, comprise a significant part of the silent majority who have not told their stories of abuse. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what are the reasons why people with learning disabilities have not told their stories of abuse?
I think there are a number of reasons that create the silence. First, and quite simply, people with learning disability have often not been asked. Second, they have told their stories and no one has listened or responded. And thirdly, it's possible that abuse is so expected and pervasive that people have not recognised that they have been abused. Other reasons relate to the fact that sexual abuse can be a taboo topic, and when coupled with disability, it becomes even more taboo. Another reason that people may not have told their stories of abuse is that we, researchers and others, are often afraid to open up a space for them to do so. People with learning disability can be seen as too vulnerable to talk about abuse. They can be seen as lacking the capacity to do so. But in our experience as researchers in this area, simply by creating an ethically and emotionally safe space to talk, such as we do in research, people have felt able to talk about the abuse they've experienced. And we have noted many times that when research is not focused on abuse, that's simply being provided with a safe and non-judgmental space for discussion where people are presumed to have capacity, appears to empower people to disclose abuse in all its forms. So fundamentally, we need to make sure that people with learning disability know that it's okay to talk about abuse if we want to ensure that abuse is challenged. The historical evidence we drew on showed that people were scared to talk about the abuse that they'd experienced when it happened to them because of further ramifications, and we'll talk about that later, because they knew they wouldn't be believed or because there was no mechanism for them to take their complaint. So it could be argued that people with learning disability might continue to experience these attitudinal and systemic barriers, and we need to ensure they don't.
In terms of your research, particular to the document, The Institutions are Places of Abuse, what were the aims and the purpose of that research?
One of the concerns was that as the conversation and the discussion grew around the call for an inquiry into abuse and care, that disabled people weren't part of the conversation. And so the motivation, I guess, for the research that we did was to show that disabled people did have a place in this conversation and had experienced abuse and care, and actually were high users of care, state care at the time when we set out to do this research. So our aims were to determine what is known, or what was known, about the abuse of disabled people, particularly those with a learning disability, and particularly to think about systemic abuse and whether there was evidence that that was at play, to identify gaps in the available evidence about abuse of people, disabled people in care. And at that time we were thinking about what sort of research pathway had the potential to address gaps in knowledge around this area, which was another aim of the work.
Were there any limitations or constraints to your research?
Yes, considerable ones. We had a very, very short time frame, and obviously limited resources. So we had to think, think carefully about how we approached this piece of work and how we could bring the voices of disabled people to the fore within the time frame and the resources that we had.
Were you able to, did you have resources to look into psychosocial disability?
That is one of the areas that we didn't delve into too deeply. They are a group of disabled people that could have been included in this research, but we did have quite a strong focus on learning disability, and noting that we didn't draw on a great deal of evidence related to people with psychosocial disability or people who have experienced mental distress, that we were definitely not saying that they were not part of the experience of abuse that other disabled people who we were able to capture in the research were also part of.
Just for clarity, can you just tell us what is a psychosocial disability?
Yeah, psychosocial disability is the terminology used in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to refer to people who experience mental distress or psychological conditions. These differ from learning disabilities in that they're generally episodic, can sometimes be alleviated by medication, and don't necessarily involve cognitive impairment. But it's really important to note that people with learning disability can also experience psychosocial disability as well.
What was your research methodology when you undertook this research?
So I think this question speaks back to your question about the constraints and how we thought about approaching this work. So the approach that we used was to conduct an integrative literature review, which is a very well recognised way of doing research, where you draw on the literature to see, what is available around the topic that you're interested in. We did it this way because there wasn't time or resource to do primary research where we went and worked directly with people who had experienced abuse. So essentially what we did was looked to the literature, looked to resources and publicly available documents of all types that contained evidence of abuse experienced by people with disabilities and primarily learning disabilities that was already available, that contained stories and evidence of abuse that we had possibly overlooked.
So the stories that you drew on already existed in the public domain, and you brought them to light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As part of your research design, were you required to define what constituted abuse?
Yes, yes we did.
How did you do that?
Yeah, we did that in two ways. The first was by utilising pre-existing definitions or types, categories of abuse as codes to begin with. And the second way we did it was by being responsive to the content and recurring issues raised in the data as other less well recognised forms of abuse came forward. One of the additional categories that we developed or included in the research was, for example, one of restraint, a category of restraint. And we did this because it featured really heavily in the stories told by individuals. Arguably, though, we could have categorised restraint as falling into psychological abuse or physical abuse categories. So, as noted in our work, abuse categories were not neatly delineated. People often experienced abuse across the spectrum of categories, and some categories of abuse shared common features. So, an emotional or psychological element to all physical elements across categories of neglect and physical and sexual abuse.
I think you've defined at least 7 different types of abuse in your brief, which we'll come to shortly.
Yep.
Just turning now to paragraph 27 of your brief. Your research has referred to personal accounts of 13 men and 5 women. Would you have preferred to have a bigger sample than that?
Yes, but I think those 13 men and 5 women told us a lot about abuse and care. But from a technical point of view, in qualitative research, there's no specified or required number for sample size. The intent of qualitative research is to acquire a depth of understanding of the lived experience of an individual or a group of individuals. So the quality of qualitative research is not determined by how many people said something, but by the authenticity of the account and its sort of transferability. That said, of course we would have liked further accounts, but the size of the body of data is not surprising given the nature of the individuals. And it's also noted, and we'll probably talk about later, that in all of the individual stories were co-constructed with a trusted person or a researcher. So there is no question that many people with learning disability could have told their story but would struggle to do so without this assistance.
We've heard evidence earlier in the week from Judge Henwood in relation to the confidential confidential listening service, and she commented about despite reaching out to groups of people with learning disabilities, that service really struggled to have people come forward. Are you able to comment on that at all and offer any solutions?
Yes, I think I spoke to it slightly earlier, that because people with learning disability often don't receive the same level of value as others, that in situations like this their stories aren't sought out as much, or they're not seen part of this particular context or situation. But as I said earlier, our experience has been in providing a really safe place for people to tell and to talk, that they often do, and often when we don't expect them to. So my advice would be to think about ways to provide supported approaches to people telling their story, but thinking very carefully around who might be involved in that with people. A trusted person is particularly important, not simply expecting people to turn up to something where that they don't necessarily understand the process or have a relationship with the people that are delivering the intended support or opportunity to tell their story.
The accounts that you drew on for your research, can you tell us the types of disabilities that the people in that research group experienced?
Yeah, most people were identified as having a learning disability. Others had a combination of disabilities, including a learning disability, being blind, disability and learning disability as well. One person was deaf, and another described as having a traumatic brain injury from a childhood illness. Others had cerebral palsy, and one other person had been misdiagnosed. It came up in the literature that we had been misdiagnosed with disability as a young child, and which led to him being institutionalised for a very long time in a psychopaedic hospital.
Just on that point of this person who was misdiagnosed, can you tell us what happened there, or how that would have happened?
Because we were drawing on secondary literature resources that had already been put together, we weren't working with people directly. Our understanding is the person had come from a situation of family hardship and ended up being placed in an institution, and then not getting out of that placement for a very long time.
What types of state care were these people that were part of your research? What types of state care were they placed in?
I think the critical thing to note is that in the accounts and the evidence that we drew on, people had been in a range of care or care placements across a really long period of time. So people had spent time in psychopedic hospitals or institutions, psychiatric hospitals or institutions. They'd been in residential homes, educational placements, and faith-based institutions for some, and foster care. Only a small number had experienced foster care within the time period we were looking at. However, that is not surprising, given that most people with a learning disability or other disabilities would likely have been placed in the larger scale institutions rather than foster care at that time.
You've referred to the word psychopedic hospitals. Can you just clarify for us what is a psychopedic hospital?
Psychopedic is a uniquely New Zealand term that was developed by a linguist in the 1960s and applied to hospitals or large institutions for people with learning or intellectual disability only. Psychopedic nursing became a nursing specialty for staff who worked in those hospitals and institutions, and the term translates to mind of a child. That's the kind of translation of that term.
So these institutions were purpose-built in New Zealand at that time for these people with learning disabilities?
Yeah, there were four psychopedic institutions in New Zealand, 2 in the North Island and 2 in the South Island. They existed for longer than the terminology of psychopedic, but which came in later. So the psychopedic or institutions that were only for people with learning disability were Templeton Centre, Kimberley Centre, Braemar and Mangere.
What was the ethnicity of the people in your research group?
In terms of ethnicity, because again we were drawing on secondary sources, and so we had to go with what we could see in the literature and that data. It was often not clearly stated, but we knew that 3 people whose stories we drew on identified as Māori, and another identified as Pacifica of Cook Islands descent. And the rest we assumed to be Pakeha, New Zealand.
What was the age, or roughly the ages of people in your group that were then when they were placed in care?
Again, because we were drawing on secondary sources, we could only go with what was in people's stories or what was included in those, but without exception, they'd all entered state care in childhood and had often remained in state care or in care into adulthood, and many had remained in some form of care for their entire lives.
I'd just like to move now to paragraph 35 in your brief, where you mentioned case studies, and your research included case studies about abuse that happened to an individual person, but also about being abused by being exposed to maltreatment of others and being powerless to stop that.
Yes.
Are you able to give us an example of that?
Yes. What we were able to do was, from some of the sources that we were able to utilise, there was a lot of information about people's experiences in care, and from those we could kind of pull together a case study of the person's whole life in those kinds of environments. And then within other sources we drew on, we saw snippets of experience that we could use to gain an understanding of the types of abuse that people with learning disabilities and other disabilities were experiencing. In terms of the case studies for some people, I won't go into a lot detail because I think Robert Martin will speak to this next week. But certainly Robert's experience that he has bravely shared with the world showed the really complex interplay of experiencing abuse himself, but also being deeply conscious of the abuse that others were experiencing around him and feeling concerned about that too. So having, and he wasn't the only person that expressed how difficult it was to be experiencing this yourself, but also seeing others and not being powerless to do anything about that.
If we move now to the different kinds of abuse that you focused on in your research, which one of those featured more frequently than any other?
Within our research, so as I said before, we did more detailed case studies which could show people what life was like on a daily basis, but then we also did a thematic analysis to go what were we seeing frequently for a lot of people. And within our research, we found that neglect featured more frequently across the different life stories in comparison to any other form of abuse. And arguably being in state care could be read as synonymous with neglect due to the fact that even if people aren't being overtly abused, they were generally exposed to an extremely impoverished relational environment. That is, most of the stories that we engaged with, people talked about feeling as though no one cared for them, or knowing that no one cared for them.
I think you've mentioned a range of different areas of neglect. Could you just give us some examples of those?
So I think in general we found that people frequently and consistently describe living situations or being in living situations where they didn't feel loved, that they had no special person in their lives who was there to love and support and nurture them. Other experiences of neglect could be seen in the lack of emotional support and connection that people received, particularly at times of distress. One person whose life story that we drew on, a person who I know very well personally, or I knew very well personally, she is no longer with us, said, "I was scared a lot in institutions. I would scream a lot. I would get in the corner and put my hands over my face, and no one ever came to comfort me." So here's a person, a young person at the time, describing living in a series of institutions all over the South Island, absolutely recognising that her behaviour was an expression of distress and that no one ever came to help her feel better or to check why she was feeling that way. Rather, some of the things that, which leads from that quote, was that people did recognise that rather than staff being attuned and responsive to their emotional needs and the way that they were trying to manage them, that people were actually punished for challenging or non-compliant behaviour. Other things that we saw were, in terms of neglect, were survivors' self-esteem being affected, with a number of people linking their experiences in care with lifelong feelings of being unwanted, feeling an acute absence of affection or emotional support, and some survivors attributed this to a difficulty they had as adults to show affection and trust other people, things that we've probably heard in other survivor accounts over the last week.
what did you note in terms of lack of stimulation?
What was interesting is that obviously a lot of the people that whose accounts and stories we drew on were able to articulate their experiences. They could communicate and share their story with another person and have it told. What's noteworthy is that they talked about, the fact that they didn't experience a lot of stimulation and there wasn't much to do, but they were also concerned about others who may have had more, a greater degree of impairment, who really, really were left to their own devices, and when they were totally reliant on other people for care or being engaged with some activity, were left for long periods of time with no one attending to their needs.
And as a result of that, were basic needs not met?
Yes. One survivor recalled the smell of people who needed assistance to go to the bathroom and were not provided, and said there were people who couldn't move and they would just stay where they had been left in the morning after breakfast. Most of these people were non-verbal and were trapped until someone got around to attending to them.
Can I ask you now to talk to us about the emotional and psychological abuse that you researched?
Yes, and I think, as I noted earlier, there's a lot of crossover between these sort of arbitrary categories of abuse, and certainly this category could also be placed or has significant crossover with neglect as well. But emotional and psychological abuse was also really apparent. The life stories and other sources of data we analysed conveyed a sense of deep fear, of hostility and distress, or of experiencing hostility towards themselves and of feeling distressed, which I think most people would agree are all strong indicators of emotional and psychological abuse. As we noted earlier, this kind of abuse could be seen in both personal maltreatment that people experienced and also due to their repeated and ongoing exposure to the maltreatment of others. Some of the people with learning disability and other disabilities who told their stories in the body of data we were able to work with interpreted some of their own behaviour as a tangible expression of distress, and they saw injurious behaviours that other people were engaging in as their way of communicating distress. And they also recognised that there was a failure to respond to those indications and talked strongly about that.
Your report mentions survivors living in constant fear. Mm-hmm. What impact did that have on their lives, long-lasting? Again, that pattern of people reporting feeling fearful, feeling that no one was there for them, was a repeated refrain coming through in them talking about their later lives. Particularly noting a difficulty in trusting people and making relationships. But in the moment, for some people, that fear of being physically hurt while they were in the environments that they were in meant that they put their own protective mechanisms in place. And for one person, she reported that she simply chose to stop talking. Talking got her into trouble, and the response to people's perceptions about her and her behaviour meant that it was safer for her to not talk. you've said, this is at para 58, that survivors left state care with an entrenched understanding that people in positions of power could hurt them if they failed to comply with expectations.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Sure. The point that we were making was that the individuals who told their stories of abuse at the time all talked about the fact that nothing could be done about it, or that no one helped them address it. Asking for help or assistance led to no action or negative action. That is, that there was some kind of negative ramification for them. So it's not surprising that that was the learnings that people carried with them for their life.
I'd like to ask you now some questions about power and abuse.
Yep.
At para 61, you've quoted the statement that abuse is the overt representation of an imbalance of power relations. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. I think I'd like to draw on the work of Professor Dick Sobsey at this point, and perhaps just make a personal comment before I explain his particular model of abuse and people with disabilities. It was interesting when we've been exploring this topic and preparing for today's hearing to draw on this particular book by Professor Dick Sobsey, who's a Canadian researcher. He's an extremely well-respected researcher, and this would be seen as the most important text on abuse and people with disabilities. Some interesting historical context is that Professor Sobsey wrote a lot of this manuscript in 1991 when he was a visiting professor at the Donald Beasley Institute. And the other interesting thing to note is that the foreword to this book, which is an international text which has circulated the globe now for 25 years. It was published in 1994. It has the foreword in this book, has the story of a New Zealand survivor of institutional abuse, Mavis May. And Professor Sobsey met or came across Mavis during his time here in New Zealand. So I think in terms of thinking about how we can miss people with disabilities in this story, we have done so for 25 years. We have had evidence sitting in the front of this book about a personal account of abuse provided by a New Zealand woman, as I say, that has circulated the globe, because many, many people draw on this book to understand abuse in the lives of people with disabilities. But I digress a little bit there. So what, and I'm not sure if we have the slide?
If we could just ask for the slide to be put up there now. Thank you.
Yeah, so what we thought would be a useful way to think about the abuse that disabled people may have experienced or have experienced in care is by drawing on Professor Sobsey's model as a way of helping people to understand the sort of power dynamic that's at play when people experience abuse. So Professor Sobsey draws on a very famous ecological model or way of understanding the world that was developed by another researcher, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and he uses it to explain how abuse was enabled to occur. And just really briefly, what he does is he highlights that abusive contexts reflect inequities in power at a relational and at an environmental and at a cultural level. And this can really usefully explain why abuse occurred and why it remained unchecked in institutional and other care environments. And in short, he says that abuse occurs in the context of power inequities. So what you can see in the model is that in the middle there is a circle which highlights relationship, and it shows that the dynamic between an offender and a victim, or a perpetrator and a survivor, whatever language you want to use, and notes that what starts to happen is that there's a developing power inequality or inequity, and there's a weakened bond between the two. He then looks at the environment that this happens in and notes that there aren't counter controls. There's no way or process for stopping this, the inequities happening. In fact, they are magnified. And then round the outside, he uses the term culture to say there's something at play that provides the support and the rationale for the power inequities and the abuse to occur. The reason that that I was thinking about this and thought it would be useful to present is when I was thinking about, after sort of listening and watching Keith Whiffen earlier in the week, who talked about the kingpin system. That model is a pretty good way to explain how such a system could happen. And I would also like to note that while they didn't use the same terms and words that Keith Whiffen used earlier in the week, that people's stories that we drew on were quite clearly describing really the same system, that there were more powerful people than them, and that there was that you had to be careful of these more powerful people within the situations that you were in. So people with learning disability and other disabilities were not unaware of that system in operation, even if they didn't use that terminology.
Can I ask you now to talk to us about control and restraint as a form of abuse?
Yes, as I said earlier, that was something or an area that or a theme that came through very clearly and strongly, and was really expressed in a distress that people had about being confined, and to the institution itself, to their bedrooms, or to specially constructed seclusion rooms. This practice could also be considered to fall into the abuse category of psychological or physical abuse as well. Again, just noting that crossover, but we viewed these practices of control and restraint as comprising such a significant component of the data that we analysed it as a separate and distinct form of abuse. So being locked up was a prominent experience, with many of the survivors describing that in detail and being very distressed by it. Being locked up was sometimes due to perceived challenging behaviours, but sometimes it was just the practice of that institution. In addition to noting the physical confinement to particular rooms and spaces, people also reflected on the highly regulated and regimented spaces and activities within the institution, including being told, but not limited to, when to shower, when to shave, when to eat, when to dress, when not to dress. Others described the process of establishing and enforcing routine and physical confinement as excessively harsh, with some survivors sharing evidence of control and psychological restraint created by staff restricting the space people were allowed to be in, and by restricting their ability to interact with friends. I'd just like to draw on a quote which evidences this. They used to put you in pyjamas. That was a horrible thing. They used to have a square table by the kitchen. That was the real bad table. If you run away, they put you in pyjamas, and on the bad table you had to stay in pyjamas all day while others had their clothes on. You had to sit in one corner by yourself, and you don't have your friends around you. Overall, this particular theme conveyed a strong sense of being trapped in state care, literally and figuratively, and confined and restricted on a daily basis in a manner that people perceived as hurtful, as excessive and as humiliating, as the previous quote evidences.
Can you also talk to us about physical abuse and what your research found in relation to that?
What was interesting and possibly worrying to find was that across the body of data, the evidence, the testimonies from people that had made their way into the public domain, physical abuse wasn't talked about as much as some of the other categories. So I think it's really important to note, for example, that a lot of what people did talk about in these accounts was the neglect and the psychological and emotional abuse that they experienced. The control and restraint was a big area, and physical abuse was kind of like a given, and people didn't talk about it as frequently. I'll come to sexual abuse in a moment, but what they did talk about was really quite extreme physical abuse. So people talked about being beaten by peers frequently and severely. They also clearly identified physical assaults carried out by staff. One survivor described being dragged down a corridor by either a feet or a hair as punishment. Sometimes small misdemeanours were met with excessive force, such as being kicked for accidentally breaking something. And I will illustrate with a quote. Excuse me. When I was 13, one of the big boys picked me up by the back of the collar, lifted me off my feet, punched me in the nose, on the side of the nose, and sort of made it bent. I went up to the nurse and told her that my nose was broken. She said she wouldn't do nothing about it. So significant experiences of physical abuse.
Can you talk to us also about sexual abuse and what was discussed there?
So in keeping with the Crimes Act and with more contemporary definitions, we define sexual abuse as any form of sexual contact that was not consensual, or any form of sexual contact that happened within two children. Both of these elements of the definition were identified within the personal accounts we explored. We found that both children and adults were sexually assaulted. We found that the assaults occurred in large institutions, residential schools, and within the family homes of their foster carers. I have a quote here before moving on with some more information. Someone who lived at Templeton Centre for many years described being sexually abused. He said, sexually abused, sodomised, I suppose you could say that it continued on, not just only me, but I think a lot of other people too. So while sexual abuse was frequently divulged or talked about in the narratives, often people touched on it briefly, although that's fairly graphic. This is likely to be because many of the resources that we pulled the information from were not really designed by way of method or in thinking about the ethics of them to respond to disclosures of abuse. So often we were finding this information in resources that have been written about deinstitutionalisation, so someone's move into the community, about their life story, etc. But that said, it was clear from the evidence we drew on that sexual violence was a seemingly inescapable and unchallenged reality for a significant number of both boys and girls and men and women in state care or care. Some of the narratives included graphic experience of the person's abuse, including when it happened, where it happened, and who the perpetrator was.
Did the people that were part of your research talk about what happened if they did tell someone about the abuse?
There didn't seem to be a lot of evidence that in people's stories that any people had ever had any redress. For example, one survivor was sexually assaulted at knife point by an older peer when she was 11. Despite being able to point him out, there was no sense in her story that the perpetrator was punished, kept away from her, or she received any psychological support for that sexual violence. Similarly, and also shockingly, another male survivors raped by older peers appeared to go unchallenged. And others also describe similar situations, again, seemingly unchallenged. I'm noting here that we are using secondary sources. We weren't talking with people directly. But essentially there was little evidence to suggest that there was ever any follow-up. And evidence to suggest that the reverse, in fact.
Could I just ask a follow-up question on that? And I appreciate you're working from secondary sources. Was there any evidence, to your knowledge, that these people were telling authorities, were able to tell anybody, or so? Because the answer could be, well, nobody did anything because they didn't know.
I think that might have been the case for some people, but for other people, it seemed to be clear that they knew that they had taken complaints or to people and hadn't had a response, or had not had a negative response. So I think, again, I'm qualifying my response, but we saw evidence of both situations there.
Thank you very much.
Just on that point, turning in your brief to paragraph 81, is that an example where someone...
Yes, yeah.
That you could complain, that you could tell us a bit more about?
Sure. One of the... can I go back a couple of points to give some context? So I noted in my brief that survivors consistently echoed the same sentiment in response to repeated trauma that they experienced, commenting that they would just keep quiet and hope that it wouldn't happen again. So similarly to reports of physical abuse, there was this deep-seated understanding that complaints would go nowhere and could even make your situation worse. This view is echoed in a judgment that we located as part of the search for this piece of work that related to someone who had been in a couple of different institutions, and the judgment evidenced that this complainant felt devalued by staff, thus leading to the dismissal of complaints within state care and a subsequent re-victimisation. So to this end, the judgment supported this person's position and said, and I'm quoting the judgment, despite the complaint, the plaintiff says that sexual acts continued to be forced on him by that and another nurse for several months. The plaintiff says that he did not complain to other staff because he thought it would be dismissed and he was scared of what could happen. He says he did not report the events of witnessing sexual assaults on others because he was scared of the consequences of the charge nurse not believing him.
Can I ask you to touch on the next heading of abuse that you've covered there, spiritual abuse?
Again, this spiritual abuse was something that we didn't draw a lot of evidence about, but we thought it was important to include because it was significant for a number of people. So while less recognised, spiritual violence featured heavily in the account of a person with a learning disability who was Māori, whose experiences in Kingseed and other institutions conveyed a sense of loss with regard to being disconnected from his culture as a child. State care facilities in which this survivor were placed were both Pākehā-centric in culture and lacked cultural competence for Māori in iwitanga. He was denied access to his culture as a Māori man, and more specifically to his iwi, which he noted in his story. Other Pākehā survivors also noted that their heritage was ignored, and I'm sure that Robert will speak to this next week, and people recounting a sort of broader disconnection from New Zealand and the world and historical events. And then at a more individual level, people talked about being unable to pursue their own interests and their passions despite expressing them, not being given the opportunity to pursue them. So living a life very devoid of that individuality that makes us, all the people that we are.
And the last type of abuse that you've covered in your research, financial abuse.
Yeah. Again, we noted this. Only a few survivors directly referred to their financial or sort of material deprivation. However, we did note that people experience such a significant lack of education or support to develop the skills required for meaningful employment if they did escape this environment, as perhaps evidence of long-term financial abuse. But probably more prominently in their stories, financial abuse could be seen as illustrated through the experience of this compromised access to education and the erosion of people's ability to be employed, but it could also be seen in people being denied opportunities to have possessions, to enjoy the money they potentially could have earned if their forced labour in institutions and other state-sanctioned care environments had been recognised. So a number of the accounts talked about they made you a slave. When I was 6 years old, I had to help. I never went to school. They wanted me to work because I was good at it. You didn't get any money, that's for sure. We didn't get any money. Restrictive environments of care also denied opportunities to get work, as I've just mentioned, and have any level of financial autonomy. Someone said, I'm disappointed that I've never had a job. I never got the chance. Money's not everything in life, but I would have liked to have been able to buy clothes. So it's briefly touched on in those comments a little considered aspect of life and care. One that I hadn't thought about until I was reading people's stories was that survivors were forced to undertake manual labour both in institutions and foster homes. And this surprising finding featured quite heavily. One person described immediate and long-term injury she suffered as a result of heavy lifting she was forced to do, and others described her time as an unpaid labourer for a foster family. And in that situation, the person, the family she was in, was also a staff member of the institution she had been living in, which suggests an abuse of power of a different kind.
I'd just like to ask you briefly about other evidence that you gathered as part of your research that came from third parties. Mm-hmm. We may not have the opportunity to go through it into too much detail, but can you tell us where you sourced some of this information?
Yes, so the evidence that we drew on from third parties was because we knew that from some of the research that we'd done in our own institution and other work of colleagues in the disability research area, that it would be useful to find information or data evidence that supported the stories that survivors had told. So we drew on some of those accounts, and so some of them included eyewitness accounts from relatives that were reported in particular stories, literature, resources, and other eyewitness accounts are from researcher observation or from staff reports in some of the institutions. So it's not about proving or disproving the survivors' stories. We believed in those, but we thought it was useful to provide some more evidence if we could find it. Most notably, the process of deinstitutionalisation has provided an opportunity for both staff and families to talk about neglect and abuse that they witnessed in various institutions. Within the New Zealand research that it's explored the process of institutional closure, for example, staff members have reported that abuse was an issue at Kimberley Centre, that they had witnessed abusive practice or actions themselves. For example, within some research that were focused on the deinstitutionalisation of Kimberley Centre, the staff member said, "See, I've been here for over 10 years all up, and these people were brought up in fear here, and I've seen that. They were brought up in fear, and when you look at the things that went on in this place, it was horrific. They were cruel, they were very cruel people. We had men out in the courtyard here. Do you know how they got showered? With fire hoses. If you rush up to one of these people very quickly, they will cower, and that's when they've had hidings at a very, very young age, the Kimberley cringe, that's what they call it." The staff quoted there were largely employed at Kimberley Centre during prior to its closure, so outside of the time frame for this inquiry. The quotes have been included to illustrate two important points: that abuse was occurring at the institution beyond the focus of this research, and that the physical, and within the focus of this research, and the physical fear exhibited by the people that lived there and observed by staff and families actually, labelled as the Kimberley cringe, was understood to be the result of a long-term pattern of abuse within the institution. It is acknowledged that both staff and residents may have been involved in abusive practice or actions that led to the development of the Kimberley cringe, or people's physical withdrawal or away from people that came close to them.
I'd like to move on now to the topic. This is from paragraph 107 onwards of your brief, and the question really was what you've described, institutional abuse.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that we considered in our research was whether the abuse that we saw when we pulled across a number of survivor stories, whether it showed, or we could call it institutional abuse, and again drawing on Professor Dick Sobsey's work. Professor Sobsey defined institutional abuse as the neglectful, psychological, physical or sexual abuse that takes place in managed institutional care of human beings. He identified the key features of institutional abuse as extreme power relations between residents and staff, a collective nature of abuse, that abuse is covered up or knowledge of it is not shared outside of the institution, and that clearly defined patterns of environmental influence are at play. And I'd just like to note, and possibly, if I've got time to read out, so just to extend on the points that I've just made.
Just while you're reading a quote, can you just speak slightly more slowly?
Just to extend on that point and to pick up on a question, I think, from the commissioners yesterday, that he goes on to say institutional care is not necessarily restricted to large custodial institutions. It includes an array of living arrangements and related programs paid for with government or other public funds that would be normally provided through less formal family and community resources. Thus, institutional abuse can take place in group homes, foster care, hospitals, residential schools, prisons, and a variety of other environments. And anyone can become the victim of institutional abuse, including people with disabilities.
I'd now like you to talk to us about systemic abuse. Can you tell us about the definition of systemic abuse?
Yeah. So in our study of survivor accounts provided by people with disabilities, and particularly people with learning disability, we drew on, the testimony we drew on was characterised by participants who were describing long-term, immediate and long-term impacts as a result of their abuse. And given the evidence, we really wanted to consider whether their abuse could be defined as systemic. We drew on the work of Sally Robinson, who's an Australian researcher, who defines systemic abuse as having causal roots that are located in organisational systems or policy, despite sometimes being perpetrated by a person. So in this definition, abuse can't be categorised as systemic due to prevalence alone. Instead, abuse must be attributable or be able to be attributed to system-level factors or failures that have worked actively or passively to enable or to facilitate abuse under the particular system. That is, in more layperson's term, systemic abuse takes us beyond the notion of bad things being done by bad people, independent of the system, to a recognition that the system has operated in ways that has both provided the opportunity for abuse to occur or for it to continue unchallenged. And I think that's what we've heard in people's stories.
If you turn to paragraph 119 with the bullet points listed in your brief there, can you just take us through those?
So what we did against that definition of systemic abuse is create a series of points that we could, or key themes for findings that we could see in the data that we had gathered in survivor stories. So we noted that the personal accounts detailed neglect in the form of people not having their basic needs met, possibly due to understaffing or inadequate training, which constitutes systemic abuse. We saw institution-wide failure to attend to the emotional and psychological development of children, potentially through understaffing, inadequate training, or allowing an abusive culture to continue unchecked. We saw the use of control and restraint practices, whether environmental, physical or chemical, for reasons of punishment rather than for therapeutic reasons, which constitutes systemic abuse. We saw repeated exposure to physical violence result in injuries being left untreated and no meaningful attempt being made to stop the assaults, which constitutes systemic abuse, and people being repeatedly sexually abused or exposed to sexual violence in the absence of any ability to achieve meaningful redress in the form of a person being held to account or counselling for psychological trauma, and a care system that allowed staff and foster carers to abuse the children and adults in their care. This is all suggestive of systemic abuse.
This systemic abuse existed that you've described. Do you have any comment or any thoughts on what can be done to avoid this in the future?
So what we saw, we were able to draw on secondary accounts that had been sitting unexplored, really. So when we go back to the beginning of the session, when you asked a question about why are people invisible, the stories were there, and the stories are there. We hadn't looked hard enough. And I think some of that speaks to the value that we place on disabled people and where we see them fitting in this issue. But the evidence on record about the experiences of abuse has largely been collected within the context of research with an alternative focus, both in terms of the nature of the data that's collected and the way it's been able to be analysed. So we need to do further exploration to really be able to learn from our mistakes from the past. But my thoughts are that in doing this, we need to examine the context in which abuse occurred and the policies and processes and procedures that were there or were not there to assess the likelihood of similar abuses permeating future systems. It speaks to the question that I was asked before. Did people complain? Did they not complain? We need to know more about what people understood. Did they understand that there was a process for complaining, or was there not? It's also important to look closely at organisational culture at a broader level, again to generate important learnings to ensure we don't let down another generation of vulnerable children and adults. I think people who experience the trauma deserve the opportunity to learn how this abuse was able to happen. So really getting to the heart of why is an important step towards that.
Coming to near the end of your brief here, one of the headings is gaps in the evidence. Mm-hmm. I'd just like to ask you briefly about the comments that you've made at paragraph 132, where you've described that people telling their stories were clear about what happened, but they were not able to unpack the circumstances that led to such practice or actions. Mm. Can you comment on that for us?
Yeah, I think we saw a range there were a range of stories told, and for some people they were able to give extensive detail and and to have a real understanding of the power dynamics that were at play, while others were simply reporting these terrible things that happened to them, which they knew were wrong and should not have occurred, but didn't have that context around them. So I'll step back to your previous question. We haven't got a full understanding of how these things were able to occur in this system of care. So it's not surprising that individuals with a learning disability who had often not even experienced any kind of life in the community, had lived whole lives in institutions, weren't able to provide complex details or really comprehensive understandings of why and how things had happened, and even when that happened, because if you've lived a whole period of life with no typical signposts of times in your life, then you're not going to be able to give a lot of detail about this happened when I was this age, around this time, etc. You don't have those things, life experiences to hang that detail on, those contextual details on.
Just in terms of the reference to the SQ review in 1980s, where you've stated there, as you said, it was unethical to simply explain away the high incidence of abuse in state care as being reflective of, quote, the time, end quote. Can you comment on that for us?
Yeah. Yes, the ASCU review sort of also supported the individual stories that we explored. So the review was a Ministry of Health review of psychiatric and psychopaedic hospitals, and ASCU described the conditions for seclusion as Dickensian, despite institutional reform that occurred through the 70s and 80s. And went on to say that some staff and institutions reported to the review team that timeout boxes and cupboards in some wards for the intellectually handicapped were used more for punishment than for any therapeutic effect, which was deemed to be more appropriate for practice for modifying behaviour. Further, they found deficiencies in dignity and in the basic elements of appropriate care. For example, that some units in psychopaedic hospitals had toilets of a bench type in nature and communal showers. The report went on and said other things about what they saw there, and concluded that staff shortages and low morale seriously affect patient care and the availability of alternative methods of treatment, and lead to a lack of awareness and general acceptance. So it could be argued that this review conducted in the 1980s has long provided evidence that neglect and abuse in care did indeed occur.
Ms. Thomas, I'll leave it to you to suggest an appropriate time at which we might take the morning adjournment.
I've probably got two more questions. Perhaps we finish those and then take the break. Just turning to the end of your brief there, where at paragraph 140, the statement that abuse and neglect are not in the past. Can you perhaps expand on that for us?
Yes, I think Hilary Stace is going to do that in the next session, but I would just note that more recent research has identified that abuse and neglect are not in the past, and that various approaches have been used to audit and otherwise assess quality of care, and that it's clear that gaps remain that make it possible for neglect and abuse to go undetected. But I will leave it to Hilary to cover off on that.
Thank you. And just finally, your final paragraph of your brief, do you have any final conclusions that you would like to make to the Commission today?
Just further to the notion of the intention of the inquiry to look to the future. I think it's important to include, to conclude by mentioning the ongoing story of abuse and care that can be seen in some of our current research. We have done qualitative research with individuals in the justice system in recent years and found that over half of our 40 participants had been in out-of-home placement in childhood, so these were all people with learning disability. Some of these people reported that they'd experienced abuse in these placements. Abuse and care has been seen again in a soon-to-be-released piece of research, which includes the story of a young person with a learning disability who in very recent years has experienced multiple foster placements, including an unacceptably high number of placements and some abuse in some of those settings. So unfortunately, this suggests very strongly that we're a long way from being able to confidently assert never again, and it reminds us why this Royal Commission of Inquiry is so critical to disabled people who have experienced abuse and care, whether it be past, present or in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We were at the point where you had concluded, Ms Thomas. I now want to ask if any other counsel wishes to exercise the right to cross-examine the witness. There is none. Colleagues, starting perhaps with you, Mr Gibson, are there any questions you have?
Yes, kia ora, Dr Mirfin, Veitch. Having heard it before, I still can't help feeling deeply moved and saddened every time I hear something like that. Our terms of reference include looking up till 2000 with the discretion to look beyond and make future recommendations. So my questions cover all of that. Outside of that institutional context, what protections, and I suppose particularly looking at the 89 Act, were available to disabled children? Were they the same as for other disabled children's? What legal safeguards were there?
I'm probably not the best person to comment on this, and Hilary will speak to some of this later, I think. The area that I can talk to in terms of the safeguards around disabled children relate to Section 141 and 142 of the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act. Just noting that the Donald Beasley Institute has done a very small piece of research in that area on the basis that those two particular clauses could be seen as treating disabled, or did treat disabled children differently, who were, so children who were unable to be cared for at home have a different route into care, and sort of treated differently while they're in care. And what we have done is talk to some people who have been subject to Section 141, who have left their family home, gone into care and disability services, and then talked about how that felt for them. So that's a more recent experience of care that we've been able to capture in research.
You talked about people with learning disabilities in the justice system. If I was to extend that, not just to that group of people, but with neurodisabilities, dyslexia, ADHD, head injury, fetal alcohol syndrome, autism spectrum, I know that there's a growing global picture that these people fill up our youth justice institutions. What's your knowledge and experience of these people through youth justice and the journey into youth justice?
Yeah, so in New Zealand we have quite a strong recognition that a significant proportion of young people in youth justice are people who would fall under that broad umbrella term of neuro disability. It's an area of research that I'm involved in a range of ways. I think we have been drawing on international research to give us a sense of the kind of scale or the numbers of young people who may fall under that particular umbrella term that are in youth justice. We are just embarking on some research to try and get a New Zealand prevalence figure around that. But essentially, I think that we can be very confident based on the knowledge of legal professionals, including very, very experienced judges who are reflecting their experience and their belief that this is a big proportion of the people who we are seeing enter into youth justice. I think it will, once we have done the research, I think it will confirm that a good number of those individuals have probably come through a pathway of care.
final question. We've heard from previous witnesses about the context of adoption, the need for families to stay together. In the context of disabled parents, what do we know? What happens? What support legal safeguards are there for disabled parent and child?
Very few. Again, another area of research that I've worked around and the Institute has worked around in sort of decade periods from the late 1990s, and we are just about to embark on another piece of research to explore the experiences of parents who have a learning disability. What we have continued to see from for the last 20 years, but earlier, are that parents with a learning disability frequently have their children removed at birth or soon after. They sometimes have their children removed before they have proven that they aren't good parents. They are assumed to lack capacity and continue to experience child removal at a very significant rate. We tend not to see family reunification within families that include a parent with a disability, a learning disability at least. And we also tend to see access being eroded so that the sort of attachment and the family relationship within those families isn't able to be maintained because they don't receive enough access and support around their access to keep that relationship going. This is an area that I feel that I can speak reasonably confidently about, hence my strong answers to this question.
Oh, good morning, Dr. Mirfin, Veitch, Talawhalawa. Thank you very much for the way in your evidence was presented, and in particular the reference to your research. I suppose as a non-academic or not a non-research background, but really appreciating the complexity. One of the questions I often ask is, at what point do we say we've got enough evidence there to actually put forward some concrete recommendations in this particular space, appreciating, of course, the limitations that you've spoken to.
Yeah, I think, well, my perspective is that we've got a lot of evidence that we've ignored or overlooked, and as a deinstitutionalisation researcher, I put myself in the category of people who have sometimes overlooked these experiences. One of the things that I didn't talk about, but that I noted in my brief, was that often we've heard the experiences. A lot of the data that we collected was around research that had occurred around deinstitutionalisation, or life histories or oral histories that people had undertaken when they've been moving out or soon after they've moved out of an institution. So while we, the collective community, disability community, we're congratulating ourselves about a job well done, we were often ignoring these stories and these voices that were coming through as we were asking people to tell us about what's good about living in the community outside of these institutional systems and structures. So I think we have evidence that we can certainly assure ourselves that abuse did occur for people with learning disability and other disabilities. What I think needs to occur is primary research with people. Our work has drawn on published accounts. I will note that some of those published accounts have originated from my organisation, the Donald Beasley Institute, so I actually did some of the research. I did know some of those people. There was a mix of me having done primary research that I then drew on for the work that I've presented here. What we need to do is to do more of that kind of work with people, and it needs to be carefully done, it needs to be slowly done, it needs to be ethically done. It's not something that you rush into without a lot of thought. I will say really strongly, however, that when the context is right, people will tell those stories, and people do tell those stories. So as I said earlier, even when we're not researching abuse, we are constantly hearing about it. Yeah.
And just a final question around the collation of perhaps your ethnicity data.
Yes.
Do you have a sense around the different ethnic groups, Pasifika as an example?
Yes, so in terms of the work that I presented today, are you asking a question in relation? We noted and talked about ethnicity where we could, but again, it speaks to your previous question. Carefully planned work allows us to explore all elements, all the intersectionalities of people's lives, whereas when we're working with secondary data, we're just taking what we can from it. Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Mirfin, Veitch, other people giving evidence to the Royal Commission have referred, not all of them, but many, to companion pieces of work occurring in Australia, Canada, the United States, for example. Is that aspect of companion work also to be thought of in regard to people with learning disability?
I think it would, by companion work, you're meaning a parallel process.
Yes.
Where a slightly different process is
Yes.
put around particular groups, would be a really appropriate pathway here. Again, what we need to be careful not to do is to treat disabled people differently, or think that they've had a vastly different experience, because I think in listening to some of the evidence this week that I can see such strong parallels, but what is important is to think about how we do work with people with learning disability, and to make the process accessible, and sometimes that might take a companion process to achieve that in the best possible way.
Thank you.
Sure. I have no questions, but thank you for your
Thank you.
Dr. Edawiti.
Thank you, Chair. Tēnā koe, Doctor, and ki te mihi ki a koe. Thank you for your evidence. So, it is of concern, isn't it, that there's so little research that's been carried out into abuse and neglect in these institutions, and very little primary research so far. And it seems also that there's still research that needs to be done in the post-institutionalisation phase too, about abuse and neglect that's continuing, because I'm assuming as a case that we've heard evidence relating to mental health institutions that despite the bricks and mortar, the closing down of the large institutions, that abuse and neglect continues, and you referred to cases in the context of foster care. So my question is about, it seems that there's even less research that's been carried out in relation to Māori and Pasifika and other minorities. Is that the case?
That is the case?
Yes, yes. And I wonder whether, in your evidence you talked about the abuse and neglect experience in the institutions, but is there further work that needs to be carried out too on oversight and standards and recruitment and training, the factors, systemic factors that led to abuse and neglect occurring in the institutions?
Absolutely. And one of the elements of our work that we have skipped over today was to sort of identify the areas of research, the gaps that we thought were there, and I'm probably unable to find that particular section very quickly, and probably didn't focus it completely, this brief on that. But essentially some of the things that we identified were the need to really explore this notion of systemic abuse more fully.
Yes.
I think we've got a reasonably some good frameworks to work from, but to be exploring it in the context of this inquiry. We noted that we only had a small number of participants who told their stories of being in foster care, and that's largely to do with the age and the time.
Yes.
But we know that from more recent research that's a real area that we need to do some, there's gaps in the research around. Obviously, working from the perspective of Māori and Pacifica. The other area that we identified was a lot of people talked about leaving their families to go into these systems of state care. And for a number of people, that's because they were in difficult family situations. So I think there's some gaps there in terms of really exploring how we're supporting families right now, and what how we're supporting, and certainly that was, a conduit to some of the placements for people that we talked with. Thank you.
So yes, so oversight, standards, training in the context of the institutions, but also in the post-institutional phase, right, including foster care.
Absolutely.
Yeah. My last question relates to Māori again, and you referred to the impact upon individual patients and cultural disconnect. And I wonder also whether there's also the bigger, broader question about whānau, hapu and iwi Māori involvement in the setting of policy, laws and practices, the institutions themselves. So there's a historical as well as contemporary angle.
Absolutely.
And the need for work in that area too.
Yeah, certainly need for work, and no one would argue that there are gaps and deficit in that area in terms of disability policy, services, supports, etc. But also the wider system that you will have more experience and knowledge around.
And to your mind, that work still needs to be developed?
Yes.
There's still a lot of work to be done. Yeah. Okay.
Definitely.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Mirfin Veitch. Your evidence is now concluded, and the Royal Commission is grateful for it. Thank you.